The research is absolutely the best part of my job. I love it. It takes by far most of my time. I would say 80% of my time working on a book is done doing research, and I love being in archives. I love traveling, and everything from, you know, the Library of Congress to the American Museum of Natural History to archives all over the world. It's been just such an enormous pleasure to be able to do that. Just speaking to the story you're talking about with Garfield, you know, they used a piece of his spine during the trial after he was assassinated and the trial for his assassin. And they still have it at the Museum of Health and Medicine. And I went there early in my research and thought, wow, this is a really interesting piece of history that I'm holding in my hand, this man's spine that still has it has a red pin sticking in where the bullet went through the spinal column. And then I worked on the book for 4 years. And then I was really excited because All Things Considered wanted to interview me, and they wanted to actually go back to this museum and bring the piece of spine back out and have me talk about it. But in that time, I felt like gotten to know James Garfield. And, you know, you try to keep a distance and keep some objectivity, but I had come to really admire him and really felt the tragedy of his death. And so when I went back and waiting, they bring in the piece of his spine on this cart, and I thought, oh my God, I'm gonna cry. I felt this incredible emotion that I really hadn't felt at the beginning of the process. And so it was a little bit of kind of keeping it together because I was going to be on radio, but it was just a really interesting lesson to me about the power of the process that we go through when we research these books.
That's great. What about you, Hampton? Anything from sort of your, you know, moments that you recall where you sort of touch that those are actual artifacts?
Yes. Well, yeah. And also, yeah, such a joy and privilege to be here with Candice. I had an opportunity to be in Kansas City with her and her husband not too long ago and see how she does her magic. So anyway, good to be sharing the digital stage with you, Candice. One example of this kind of relic thing that we're talking about that springs to mind, I think that all historians fantasize about this notion of like, I'm going to call a descendant of one of my characters, and they're going to have, you know, a trunk in the attic full of yellow letters. And well, this book I wrote about the Arctic in the Kingdom of Ice, I was trying to track down relatives of the main character, the captain of the ship, George DeLong. And I called all the DeLongs in New England because I'd heard that that's where most of the family was. And this one woman on about the 20th call picked up and she said, yes, you've called the right number. And I was just in the attic and I found this trunk full of letters. Would you like to take a look at them? And, you know, I thought it was I was hallucinating. I got on the first plane I could get to Connecticut, and turned out it was all these letters, all the personal papers of Captain DeLong's wife, Emma, who lived a long life, saved everything, and had written all these letters to her husband in the Arctic and had sent them by way of Arctic whaling ships, hoping that they would read, they were essentially love letters, hoping that they would reach him. And, you know, these letters never did reach him for a variety of reasons. But I mean, they still had the red wax seal on them. They still, you know, there is something about also just holding that piece of paper and smelling it and sort of the tactile part of it that I think is one of the joys that historians do get to feel. Sometimes it's in an archive, but sometimes it's from someone's attic, which is even better. And all these papers that she gave me are all going to end up at the Navy Museum in Annapolis, Maryland. But anyway, those kinds of experiences occasionally come along, and they're really wonderful when they do.
And so, you know, more and more, a lot of these archives are being digitized, which is great in many ways. It opens up the possibility of doing so much research remotely. but what do you think is gained? What's lost? By sort of that process of more and more being digitized, and maybe you don't go to the archive, you don't go to the library yourself.
Yeah, you
So
go
I'll,
ahead.
I'll go first. Anytime I can go, I do go, and I've been very lucky to be able, as I said, to go a lot of places. It's hard for me. I have 3 children still at home, so it's a lot of kind of figuring things out. In fact, I was really lucky. I just got back from Africa for my latest book. I was in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, and then Zanzibar for a little bit, and I just got back on March 8th. So I really cut it close before everything shut down, and who knows when I'd be able to go. But obviously there are times you can't, and I think it's a godsend that we are able to see things remotely. I mean, even places that I have gone, you don't always get everything, or you don't always know. I always say I do all my own research, first of all, because I love it, but also I don't always know what I'm looking for, or I don't know what's going to be important. I have obviously certain things that I need, but when you go, you flip through things and you're like, wow, this is incredible. And whether or not it makes it into the book, it definitely informs your understanding of the story. And I think it adds so much actually being there. But many times I've gotten home and realized, wait, there's this other letter that I really need, or multiple letters. This happened with my book on Churchill. I spent a lot of time at his archives in Cambridge, and it was great. But I got back and I kept finding, it's Winston Churchill. So there's just so much information and there's so much there. I had to keep reaching out to them and saying, hey, could you send me this too? And they can do it so easily now, and I so easily can look and see if they have it. Sometimes you can download it right off, or they can send it to you. So it really, really helps make our job possible. Without it, I think often of writers who wrote, a decade or more ago, and I think it'd be just a much harder job.
Well, and another thing that's kind of cool is like old newspapers have become digitized more and more and more, and it's searchable. I mean, you can pick a word and find whatever. It's enabled us to actually find little nuggets that were almost impossible to find before. Going through microfilm and microfiche. So that part of it is a godsend. How much stuff you can now search through without having to just go through every edition of the Des Moines whatever paper from 100 years ago. So that's a cool development that I think historians have to applaud.
The one of the threads that I sort of really enjoyed by both of your writing, Candice, you touched on this sort of what if of the Garfield presidency, sort of what if, what could have happened if he hadn't been assassinated, and to me too, sort of with Martin Luther King and the Poor People's Campaign about, what could have happened if he too had not been assassinated. I'm curious what appeal those sort of scenarios have to you, and how that sort of affects how you approach a story. Is sort of how much do you want to sort of look to the future that never was, kind of thing. Hampton, maybe you could start a little bit on that.
Almost like hypothetical history, or
Yeah, I mean, you're not writing that. That's more the area of fiction writers. But I'm sort of curious how you think about that as you sort of, especially as you sort of conclude your narratives.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Martin Luther King in my book Hellhound on His Trail, which is about the manhunt for James Earl Ray, and it's about the assassination in Memphis, which is where I was born and raised. And I think people in Memphis think about that every single day. Like how would the history of Memphis be different if King had not been assassinated, and had not been assassinated in that city during that garbage workers strike, and with the Poor People's Campaign going full tilt then. How would history, and it's certainly the kind of question you can begin to ask anew with all the things that have been going on in the last couple of weeks, with the protests and with the revisiting the question of police brutality and the just everything that's been going on. It's kind of fun and interesting to think about the road not taken, or the fork in the road that could have gone a different way. One perfect example, I think, is that the extent to which Martin Luther King's personality was so powerful and his charisma was so potent that when he died, that Poor People's Campaign really kind of unraveled. There really is as strong a personality as Ralph Abernathy was, the #2 guy. He just couldn't pull it together. And that Poor People's Campaign movement in Washington that summer it was a mess. It was a beautiful mess in a lot of ways. It raised a lot of very, very important issues. But you begin to realize the extent to which the movement at that point was invested largely in one personality. And when he was assassinated, that whole house, that whole edifice kind of imploded. So yeah, it's an interesting exercise, and it's certainly something that we've seen a lot of now in like miniseries and limited series on television is hypothetical history, like The Man in the High Castle. What if Hitler had won, and they divvied up the United States between the Japanese and the Germans? That kind of notion of what if we had a wormhole into a different possibility of history. It's an interesting idea, and it's certainly something that I do think about quite often.
Yeah, Candice, and with the Garfield book, it seems to be the appreciation I think that you gained from him that you talked about. I think is sort of tinged by the sadness of what didn't his administration cut short.
Yeah, absolutely. I did think about that a lot with Garfield. I genuinely feel like he would have been one of our great presidents, and we would have progressed so much more quickly with him as president had he lived. Actually, the book that came to mind when you were asking that question for me is my book on Winston Churchill, because it's about when he's such a young man. So he's 24 years old. He's in South Africa as a journalist covering the Boer War, and he's captured and he's put in this POW camp. And being Winston Churchill, he escapes, and it's this incredible escape had it been anyone. But the fact that it's Winston Churchill is what really just blew my mind. He made it across almost 300 miles of enemy territory by himself, without a map, without a compass, without a weapon. No food, he didn't speak the language. And I kept thinking about, and especially recently I read Eric Larson's Splendid in the Vile, which is, about Churchill's first year. And Hampton was saying about how a movement or a moment can revolve around a single personality. And, that was actually very, very true in the early days of World War II with Winston Churchill. And so I kept thinking, what if he hadn't survived this? He was on his own. He didn't know really where he was going, how he was going to get there. And he had the Boers who were humiliated and enraged, searching everywhere for him, and would very likely have killed him had they caught him. And so the idea that Winston Churchill would have died at having just turned 25 years old and would never have been there, that unique personality, a very flawed human being, yes, but a unique personality that we needed, his country needed, our country needed at that time, that really inspired so many people, so many nations to keep fighting. It's really difficult to imagine what it had been like had we not had him.
That's great. Some more of a sort of a process question, but how long do each of you research before you start putting the metaphorical pen to paper? Do you write as you research, or is it more of a get a bunch of research in and then start writing?
Well, I used to have this very naive idea that you couldn't write a word, you couldn't write a single word of your book until you had researched everything and knew everything cold. That there was almost this Maginot line between research and then writing. And that is a formula for endless procrastination. it's a formula for never getting the book written, because theoretically you could research something for the rest of your life, any subject, any of these big subjects that we're drawn to, like the Korean War. My last book, I think I could have researched it for 30 years. So you do have to discipline yourself, and you do have to understand that, you got to, I've gotten better at writing a little bit and then researching and then writing some more and then researching and then figuring out where my holes are. And so that when I go about researching, I'm a little more efficient, because I'm trying to plug a particular hole. I'm not necessarily researching with a sawed-off shotgun. I'm using a laser. So that's part of it. But let's be honest, the research is the fun part. And that's the other reason why it takes so long, is that we're, at least for me, I love the travel. I love going to the archives. I love mastering, a subject and getting in that sort of a time machine and going back and trying to understand what they were reading, how they carried themselves, what the architecture was like, all that period stuff is a big part of the fascination and a big part of the joy of doing these books. So, and for me also very important, I think, is physically going to the landscape that you're writing about, physically going whenever you can to the place where the person sat or thought or worked. I know you can do a book without doing those things. And in the time of COVID, I've had to curtail some of that kind of maybe superfluous research. Although I was in French Polynesia when this all happened, the COVID madness, and I don't know why I ever left. I'm researching a new book about Captain James Cook and his third and final voyage, and that's where I was, not Zanzibar, but somewhere equally nice, Tahiti and French Polynesia. And to walk the places where these characters walked, to try to see it from, you have to squint sometimes, because those places have changed a lot. Sometimes that can lead you astray, because you think you understand a place, but you got to realize you're talking about 200 years ago, 250 years ago. But physical travel to the landscapes, for me, is every bit as important as going to the archives. But eventually you got to stop and you got to start writing. And, and then if you don't do it, your editor will call you and he will make you do it.
Candice, what about you?
I completely agree with everything Hampton said. I love going. I love doing the research. It's a very dangerous thing for me, because I could go on and on and on. And also, they're just like always some great story, like a great new book that you found, or another person who has some insight into the story. I mean, it is really endless, and that's the great part of it, because it's so fun. I always laugh with people, because people make fun of my footnotes because they're just huge. But part of it is I stick stuff in my footnotes that I can't get in the book because it's a distraction. And I know my editor, Hampton, and I have the same great editor. I know he'll be like, okay, enough, Candice, that's enough on that. So I put him in the footnotes, because I'm like, but nobody knows the story that I found, and it's really cool. So I'll put it in the footnotes. But most of my time still is doing research. I still spend the majority of the time on doing research. And then I have probably about a year where I outline. I'm a big outliner. When I talk to students, schools, they always hate to hear that I think, at least for me, what I do and the way my mind works, I really need to outline so I can understand how the story is going to work. And also, once I start writing, it's you really want to think about, obviously, word choice and pacing and rhythm and all of those things that it's all the leaves, and you can't step back and kind of see the forest. And so I really spend a lot of time working on my outline, and that's when, as Hampton was saying, I find the holes in my research. So for example, when I was writing the story about President Garfield's death, and Alexander Graham Bell was a big part of the story, and he had developed something called an induction balance to try to find the bullet in Garfield. And I knew that they had that actual induction balance. They have it, Smithsonian has it, right, at the Museum of American History. And I had been there, and it's in what I call the assassination little cubicle area, right, where everybody goes and looks at Lincoln and Kennedy, and then there's poor Garfield behind him and McKinley. But so I knew it was there and I had seen it. And then, but when I was writing, I thought, I want to be able to describe it. So I want to be able to say, okay, what kind of wood it's made of and how heavy it is and what are the dimensions. So I called and I talked to an archivist there, and she said, which one? And I said, what do you mean, which one? And she said, well, we have not just that one, but we have all the different prototypes that Alexander Graham Bell made while he was trying to help save Garfield's life. And so, like Hampton, I was like, okay, I'm on the next plane. I'm coming back. So I went back, and they took me down to the bowels of the museum, and they brought out box after box after box of these induction balances that sorry about that Alexander Graham Bell had donated to the museum after Garfield had died. So they'd been just sitting in there, and it was incredible. They brought them back, and they're like these wires hanging off of them. They're different shapes and sizes, and I could just feel Bell's heart pounding, his mind racing, knowing that the world is watching while the President of the United States lies dying in the White House.
That's great. We've got a great question from the crowd here. Do you ever create dialogue, or is everything you have in your books literal from the archives?
Candice, no, I never create dialogue, and that's one of the things when I'm looking for my next topic. One of the criteria I have, and I've fallen in love with a lot of topics over the years that I didn't actually end up writing because I didn't feel like I had enough primary source material. Because primary source material is not only where you get the story and where you get all those colorful things that make the story come alive, but it's where you get dialogue, and a lot of times people will ask me that question, well, how did you know he said that? Well, somebody wrote in their diary, or somebody wrote in a letter, and I said this and then he said that. I mean, it's just kind of like we do now with text or email or whatever. They'll say it, or it'll be in a newspaper article, and so that's where I get my dialogue, and that's it's absolutely what they said. I would never ever make it up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can't make it up, and yet one example of where I use dialogue in Martin Luther King in the Hellhound on His Trail, the last moments of his life when he is getting dressed to go to dinner at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, and he's with his good buddy Ralph Abernathy for 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes. He's shaving, he's putting on his tie, he's putting on his suit. And there's a good bit of dialogue in that passage. And it comes from Ralph Abernathy's memoir and other sources having to do with Ralph Abernathy. Well, did the dialogue happen exactly the way he remembered it? Probably not. I mean, it'd be hard for us to reconstruct the dialogue that we just had 5 minutes ago on this digital platform. But as long as you cite, where it's coming from, that it's coming from these written sources from an eyewitness, in this case, the only other person in the room. And as long as you're a little bit skeptical in the way you use it. I mean, you can't have long passages. I mean, the telltale sign for me is always when there's a long block of type, like a long passage of someone trying to remember what someone said. It's one thing when you're having a line and a line and a line, back and forth. But that I think is probably the single biggest liberty that narrative historians take, is using dialogue taken from sources like memoirs and letters and other things to create the feel of a conversation. I do a lot more paraphrasing than I do putting in quotes, because I'm always skeptical of it. How do you remember it exactly that way? How, but you are trying to create the impression of two people talking, because that is in fact the way events unfold quite often, is people talk. So I do think though that it's the single biggest license that narrative historians sometimes have to do is to use some dialogue, but it has to come from a source, and it has to be a good source. An eyewitness, someone who was truly there. but you have to cite it for what it is and make it clear in your notes. This is where it's coming from.
How do you organize your notes? How do you make sure that you're keeping track of your facts and dates and quotes and all of that?
So while I'm researching, as well as outlining, I keep files, just like Word files. And I try the information you get, you don't always know how you're going to use it. So it might be to help explain somebody's personality or their childhood, or you just don't really know at the time, like where it's going to fit best in the book. And the most frustrating thing for me that I learned early on is when there's something great and you made a note of it, and you years later when you're ready for it, you're like, I know, I remember reading that where, and you can lose days trying to find it again. So I just make a little, I'm super old school, make a little parenthetical note just of the name and the page number or whatever, just so I can quickly go back. And then it does help then again years later when I'm putting together the footnotes, I can do that fairly quickly, because that can be a really onerous process.
And then Hampton, anything from you on that?
Oh, well, I'm not innately a very organized person, and I've had to learn the hard way, by doing all these books, getting better and better with each book at organizing my stuff, and so that I can find it. Because I think instinctively I'm the sort of person who just goes into the refrigerator and just, I'm going to make a smoothie, and I'm just going to start throwing stuff in there, and I forget what's in there. I can't remember. It tastes good. But then you have to do the notes at the, and you have to track down every quote, and every salient fact has to be notated and cited properly. And that first time I did my notes, I realized that I had made a smoothie. I had no idea what was in it or where I got it. And I'm not no idea, I'm exaggerating, but with each one of these books, I've gotten much better at those notes. That that terrifying thing that Candice is describing, of like, you've got this amazing quote, and you got it, and you got it from a good source, but you just can't figure out where. And it takes days, literally days, to track that down. And I'm never going to let that happen again, because it's such a painful, it's like going to the proctologist or something. It's a very, very painful experience. And so organization pays in the end.
Another question from the crowd. Has your research ever changed the direction you thought your book was going to go? I guess Hampton, you first.
Oh, definitely. And I'd say the best book that illustrates that kind of thing is a book I wrote about the American West. It's called Blood and Thunder, and it's about sort of the life and times of Kit Carson and his role in the conquest of the American West, the western third of the continent. Originally, I had decided to write a book about the Long Walk of the Navajo people, which is, the largest tribe out here in the Southwest. I live in Santa Fe, and I was curious about the Navajo, and I decided to write about their long walk, which is kind of like the Trail of Tears. It's their version of a captivity experience, but luckily they were ultimately allowed to come back to Navajo country. But that was what the book was going to be about. But then I began to read about the guy who led their removal, their conquest, and rounded the Navajo up. A guy named Kit Carson, very, very controversial frontiersman. And I just, started reading about him and realizing that he had been everywhere in the American West. He knew everyone. He, even though he was this illiterate frontiersman, he was like, it was almost like Forrest Gump or something, or Zelig. He was just inexplicably there at every major crossroads of the Western historical experience from the 1840s, 50s, 60s. So I began to think, now this is a book that's a lot bigger than just the Long Walk of the Navajo. That's near the end. And it grew and grew and grew. And maybe at first, much to the chagrin of my editor, it changed completely from my original proposal and from my outline. It grew chronologically. It also grew, spatially. It literally became a much bigger book, and a much better book, I think. I do think there are times when the material speaks to you and tells you you were wrong in the way you first visualized it or conceptualized it. You've got to kind of have a little bit of a organic give and take with the material. And in that particular case, that book expanded so much that the story of the Long Walk of the Navajo is the last 3 chapters of a 48 chapter book. So no regrets. It's a much better book because of it. It almost took all those previous chapters to explain how we got to the Long Walk of the Navajo, why we were rounding these people up, and this tragedy that took place in the American Southwest. So I do think that it's really important sometimes to just let the material lead you in an unexpected direction.
And Candice, has there been a instance where that's how it happened to you?
Yeah, very similar. My book about Garfield, Destiny of the Republic, I actually was researching Alexander Graham Bell. My first book had been about Theodore Roosevelt, but I didn't think, I want to write about another president. And like most Americans, I didn't know anything about Garfield, so he wasn't at all in my mind. I was researching Bell. I wanted another book that had a lot of science in it. And then I stumbled upon him inventing this induction balance. And so I thought, I wonder what Garfield was like. And I start researching him, and I'm thinking, oh my God, this guy is incredible. He was absolutely brilliant. He was our last president born in a log cabin. He didn't have shoes until he was 4. So to put himself through college, he was a carpenter and a janitor. By his sophomore year of college, they made him an assistant professor of literature, mathematics, and ancient languages. And he was president of this college by the time he was 26. He was this incredible classicist. He knew the entire Aeneid by heart in Latin. And while he was in Congress, he wrote an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem. So my poor husband was always a victim here, because whenever I'm starting research, especially, I'm always calling him saying, oh my God. So this guy is incredible. He was incredible. And he also just had, a heart as great as his mind. He hid a runaway slave. He was instrumental in bringing about Black suffrage. He was a hero in the Civil War. Frederick Douglass stood beside him during his inauguration. He just was this incredible, kind, decent human being, just the kind of huge book reader kind of person we want in the White House. And so I thought, I want to write about Garfield. And I hadn't given my proposal yet, but I wrote the proposal. And I remember both my agent and my editor saying, oh, Garfield, okay, you want to write about this Garfield? But God bless them, they let me do it. And it was really one of the great experiences of my life working on that.
That's great. So Candice, you have a talent of looking at people like Churchill and Roosevelt, who people think they know, who are more famous 10 times over, and people think they know really well. How do you find new ways to talk about these key figures that people probably think they've heard enough about?
Well, again, I didn't start out thinking I want to write about Theodore Roosevelt. I want to write about Winston Churchill. With Theodore Roosevelt, I was working at National Geographic. I had been there for many years, but I was living in Washington. I was getting married and moving to Kansas City, thinking, what can I do? And I just came upon this story of him. It was actually a very good friend of mine who was working on a book called 1912 about the election of 1912. And he said, have you ever heard about this trip that Roosevelt took down this unmapped river in the Amazon? And even though I had, read about Roosevelt, read biographies, they kind of skip over this part of his life because it came after his active political career. And so I started researching, and again, working at National Geographic, I was like, oh my God, I can write about the Amazon. There's so much to say about the Amazon, but not that many people will read a book just about the Amazon. they'll read a book about Theodore Roosevelt in the Amazon that has murder and, an attack by a tribe and drowning and Roosevelt nearly taking his own life. I mean, all these things happening, and to understand why Theodore Roosevelt, this great hunter, and his co-commander, this man who had spent most of his life in the Amazon, and they're in the richest ecosystem on earth, why are they starving? And so to understand that, I got to talk about the Amazon, and I got to talk about evolution, all these things that I was really interested in and have been steeped in for years at National Geographic. So, and then with Winston Churchill, it was the complete opposite. It was before his active political career. So this is, he's such a young man, and this is what launched his political career. So, and that story, my husband had worked for the New York Times for years, began his career in South Africa covering the ANC. And so almost 30 years ago when I met him, he told me, hey, did you know that Winston Churchill was a POW in South Africa? And I just kind of kept that in the back of my mind. And after I turned in my Garfield manuscript, thinking this might make a good book.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I have to, in Ghost Soldiers, but also I guess in both of your many books, you talk about some great ordeals that Americans have had to experience in years past. And Hampton, you made mentions to sort of the pandemic and these sort of really historic times we're living in now. What have you learned about what it takes to endure moments of great distress and of national pain? And I guess Hampton, maybe I'll start with you.
Ghost Soldiers is probably the ultimate example of the books I've written of people being put to their ultimate test or the ultimate limits of endurance. That was a book about survivors of the Bataan Death March who lived for 3 years in a just sordid prison camps in the Philippines run by the Japanese, and the brutality and the disease and the starvation. And so, one of the big themes in that book is survival, and a lot of qualities that come to the fore, whether it's a faith in God or faith in your country, or patriotism, or the luck of good physical genes, good genes. But one of the things that maybe was the most surprising to me was a sense of humor. That even in these sordid prison camps, these guys were pulling pranks. They were finding ways to laugh. They were finding ways to laugh at their captors and themselves. And I think that that's maybe the most underappreciated survival skill, is us being able to laugh in the face of just abject horror. And it's certainly something that I found to be true with many of the guys that I interviewed for Ghost Soldiers.
And Candice, anything from sort of the stories of Roosevelt or Churchill that, maybe from really great leadership, or what it takes in terms of the leadership skills that require to bring a country or a community through a time of great distress?
What was interesting to me, again, with Churchill, when he was in South Africa and he's such a young man, you see the same qualities in him at that time at 24, 25 years old that you will see 40 years later that are so important to his leadership skills. And so his determination, his creativity, his courage, his brilliance, his strategy. But also, I think to me seems most important with Churchill, again, even at a young age, was that not only did he believe in himself, but he believed in you. And he believed in everyone who was listening to him, and everyone he needed to do something. So there's a moment when Churchill is captured. He's on this armored train. The Boers have set up these stones at the bottom of this hill. They shoot at them at the top of the hill to make the train go faster. The train hits the stones, it goes off the tracks, and they're shocked. And Churchill, again, 24 years old at this time, really one of the only civilians, he's a journalist on this train, the rest of arms, he instantly takes over. He instantly starts running around. I mean, he's very arrogant and he drove everybody crazy, but they listened to him and he knew instantly what to do and they listened to him. So he believed that he could do it and he believed that they could do it and they believed him. So it's this sort of contagious courage. And absolutely we see that 40 years later. And it's just a fascinating skill. And I think that it's a talent like any talent. Like I think, there's some people who can paint and some people who can sing, and the rest of us can try and we can, take classes, but we probably won't get there to any great degree. But, and I think it's the same with leadership. I think it's an innate quality. Either you have it or you don't, and Churchill just had it in spades.
We've got a great question from the crowd. What are, Candice, you talked a little bit about great dialogue, great primary sources. What are some of the other aspects of a great book idea? What are the other parameters you look for when you're trying to narrow in on a book idea that'll be like, yes, I want to pursue that?
Well, obviously the central story and the characters around it, and again, to me at least, when I try to write the kind of book that I would want to read. And when I read a book, I want to be completely lost in the story. I don't want the writer to tell me, oh, and when I went there, a couple of years ago to check it out, because that tears you out of the story. I want to just kind of forget where I am, who I am, what I'm doing, and just completely be in this story. And again, in order to have that, you just have to have I can't stress this enough, not just like a lot of primary source material, but like so much that you honestly believe you'll never get through. Just what Hampton was saying, you finally have to tell yourself, I have to stop. I'll give you an example of a book that I didn't end up writing, that I actually spent a year working on. It's about Benjamin Franklin, the only surviving home that he lived in. It's in London. And years ago, I read this article about it because it had just fallen into disrepair. There were squatters living in it. So the friends of Benjamin Franklin bought it and they were renovating it. And they had these people working in the basement and they were digging, and this guy found some bones. And then he found more bones and more bones. He ended up finding 1,200 human bones in this basement. And so they call the police, and the police are like, these are really old bones. They get a forensic anthropologist to come in, and he said he dated those bones to exactly the time when Benjamin Franklin was living in this house. And he lived in this house for almost 18 years, right before the Revolution. So you think, founding father serial murder, what is going on? And it turns out that he lived there with this widow and her daughter Polly, and Polly's husband, who was an anatomist at a time when it was illegal, and they literally had like deals with these resurrection men, grave robbers. They had a tunnel going from this house to the Thames to bring in bodies. There was a gallows just over the garden wall. They would make deals with people. So anyway, it's just this incredible story. I know that Benjamin Franklin was there. There were no medical schools in the United States at that time. He was bringing medical students there to study with this man, Matthew Hewson. He had become like a second son to him, but I couldn't prove it. So they don't, he even had a little newspaper for their house that they wrote, but I tried everything. I finally got a hold of Hewson's descendants who are in Philadelphia now, who are also doctors, begging them for any kind of diary or anything, just proof that Benjamin Franklin was in that basement, also doing the autopsies, but I couldn't prove it. I have a lot of others during the British Enlightenment. It's a great story. And the address is 37 Craven Street, which is going to be my title. So nobody take that story. I might still do it. But it's a heartbreaker sometimes. Literally, I spent a year working on that.
Hampton, anything from you, criteria you look for when you're coming along for a book idea?
Yeah. Well, I think that the real trick for doing narrative history that people are going to read, hopefully, and buy and talk about, it has to have a tighter aperture, than just, oh, I'm going to write about Benjamin Franklin. yet another book about Benjamin Franklin. Yes, there are a few really great biographers out there who can bring something new to the subject of Ben Franklin in a traditional way, but it would take someone like Candice Millard to find the aperture that tightens that story down, and you see him in a different light. Whether it's the last, when an adventure in the Amazon that Roosevelt takes, or whether it's and probably a good example of the current book. A lot of books have been written about James Cook, Captain Cook. And they're almost always cradle to grave, massive biographies that, are 800 pages, 1,000 pages. He had 3 voyages, each one as important as the next, or as the one before. And, I guess I took a page from kind of what Candice does, which is, taking a great figure, a great historical figure, and tightening that aperture. In this case, my voyage is about the third. My book is about the third voyage. I only look at that one period. We now have a much more limited chronology. We have a much more limited geography. It also happens to be the voyage where he was murdered. Everything tightens down, and suddenly, at least for me, everything becomes more interesting because you can keep track of these characters. You're not trying to do a biopic. It's something it's very tight. And I mean, still plenty. I mean, he went from, the Antarctic to the Arctic. He went everywhere on this voyage, but it's a much more compressed. So I think compression is one of the big qualities that you look for in a good narrative history. Like it's not endlessly expansive or diffuse. It's compressed down to some kind of story that has a beginning, middle, and end that's real clear to me, to all of us. But the countervailing part of this is that, I think we're all actually looking for a book that is about somebody we've never heard of, right? Like this happens all the time when people propose a book about, an amazing story, but it's somebody you've never heard of. It becomes a book that is very difficult to sell. If you can find a book about Roosevelt but it's a chapter of his life that you haven't heard of, it's much easier to get people interested. So anyway,
Yeah,
that's a
awesome
tension I think that all writers have.
Sure. And another question we've got from one of our Zoom attendees here, for you, Hampton, and I think Candice, you might have some interesting thoughts on this too, is as you're researching your book about Cook, how do you sort of deal with sort of the imperialist implications of their actions? And do these conditions, affect how you choose subjects or how you frame your narratives? Do you wrestle with how you frame sort of the adventure and narrative when you're dealing with the real consequences that I think as a nation we're really just starting to grapple with now? In many ways.
Well, I mean, you deal with it the best you can. I have a whole lot of material. I have a whole lot of chapters in my book which are about the Polynesians, about their navigation across the Pacific, about their culture, about their perspective on Cook. I don't certainly celebrate Captain Cook himself or imperialism. He's a very controversial person, though, and I do think controversy is an important part of selling history. I mean, the number of people who actually buy history is frighteningly shrinking all the time. And whenever you can connect a historical subject to current controversies or make it have a pulse in some way, make it seem relevant to today's arguments and discussions, then you're halfway there. In terms of getting someone to actually pick up the book. Cook is very controversial cat right now, and especially in Australia and New Zealand. Certainly I don't celebrate him. I just try to explain what happened. I try to capture the kind of the tactile qualities of what it was like to be on a voyage like that. When we have these encounters with indigenous people on all these different islands, There is a problem that historians do have with that, telling of that story, which is the English have documents, and the Polynesian stories are all passed down through oral history. And, there's an old school of thought that says you can't use oral history. It's suspect. It's, you're talking about hundreds of years of people passing down stories without anything being written. Well, in my case, I use the oral history. Of course I do, because it's what we have to work with. But you have to label it as such and make sure it's understood that this is the way the story has been passed down. But it's it's absolutely a story. The Captain Cook story is a story that has just a huge resonance today in what's going on all over the world.
Candice, anything from you?
Yeah, I completely agree. I also try to always tell the story about the people who live in these places. For instance, with Theodore Roosevelt, he's on this river in the middle of the Amazon, and any other book that you read that was written before my book came out, if it talks about this expedition at all, it just says at some point they were attacked by indigenous tribesmen. So my question was, who were these people? So I spent a lot of time. I worked with anthropologists at the American Museum of Natural History. I worked with several in Brazil, and I went to this river and I met with Cinta Larga. And again, it's oral history, but I think it's absolutely valid and absolutely important. I mean, the Cinta Larga, this is part of their tribal history now. They remember they've told their children and they've told their grandchildren about when Roosevelt was there and when they killed Rondon's dog and watching them bury Simplicio. So they remember all of these things, and it was hugely, hugely important to my understanding of the story. With Winston Churchill, I talked a lot about how the Boer War affected Africans, and I talked a lot about this man named Solomon Plaiki, who was this incredible person who taught himself all of these languages. He was a translator for Africans who are often accused of crimes and taken to trial and have no idea what anyone was saying. And so he would serve as translators. He wrote newspapers for Africans, and he became the first secretary of the ANC. The book I'm working on now has this man named Sidi Mubarak Bey, who was without question the most accomplished guide in the history of African exploration. He worked with Burton and Speke when they were there. He worked with Speke and Grant. He's the person who helped Henry Morton Stanley find David Livingstone. So, and then he worked with Cameron. He's the only person who has traveled the entire coast from west to east of Africa, the entire breadth of the continent. And so he's this incredible person, and often these people are completely forgotten because, as Hampton said, they didn't write. I mean, Sidi Mubarak Bombay couldn't write, but all these men he traveled with wrote about him. So I have their descriptions of him, and I have their stories about him, and I know his story about he was kidnapped as a child, he was taken as a slave to India, he made his way back, everything that happened to him, I know. So I think that's really important to tell that aspect of the story that's been forgotten or overlooked.
That's really excellent, and in many ways, I think that brings us sort of full circle to the first question, where Hampton, I think you talked a little bit about how yes, many of these dialogues, these stories are written, but even then, you can't really know, if that really what people remember, how it actually was said. And so these oral histories really do offer us some really great stories and some really good information about stories that may not have been shared in books past. And I think that gets up to our 8 o'clock time. This flew by. Thank you to you both for your answers, and thank you to the crowd for your great questions. And I think we're gonna mostly leave it at that.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
I will jump in here to say my thanks as well to Candice, Hampton, and Brian for tonight's program. It's been such an incredible, insightful, lively conversation. And thanks to you, our incredible audience, so engaged, incredible questions. Please join us next week on Wednesday, June 17th at 7 o'clock for our next Two Writers Talking event, which will be a conversation between Danny Shapiro and Daniel Mendelsohn, moderated by Los Angeles Times Books editor Boris Kochka on the art of writing about their fathers. You can find a link to that event in the Zoom chat. And yeah, thanks again to everyone. We'll see you next time. Have a great night.
Thanks
everyone.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye, Hampton.